History is filled with conflicts that have shaped the world, but few are as bizarre as the Pig War of 1859, a border dispute between the United States and Britain that nearly escalated into war, all because of a pig. This peculiar standoff, which took place on San Juan Island, a small but strategically located island in the Pacific Northwest, is a testament to how minor misunderstandings can spiral into full-blown crises. While the conflict ultimately resulted in no human casualties, it showcased the fragile nature of international relations and how careful diplomacy can prevent unnecessary bloodshed. To understand how the Pig War began, we must look at the territorial disputes between Britain and the United States in the 19th century. By the early 1800s, both nations were expanding their influence across North America, often leading to overlapping claims. One of the most contentious areas was the Pacific Northwest, where British interests were largely represented by the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, a powerful fur trading enterprise that had operated in the region since the late 17th century. Meanwhile, American settlers, fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny, were pushing westward, determined to claim new lands for themselves. Both the British and Americans sought control over the Oregon Territory, an area that encompassed modern-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of British Columbia. In 1846, to prevent further disputes, Britain and the United States signed the Oregon Treaty, which was intended to establish a clear boundary between their respective territories. The treaty set the border along the 49th parallel, running from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. However, the wording of the treaty was vague when it came to the San Juan Islands, a small but strategically valuable archipelago situated between Vancouver Island and the mainland. The treaty stated that the boundary would run through the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's island, but it failed to specify which channel. There were two main waterways, Haro Strait and Rosario Strait, and depending on which was chosen, the San Juan Islands would either belong to the United States or Britain. This ambiguity led to both nations claiming the islands, setting the stage for a future confrontation. By the 1850s, tensions had begun to rise as American settlers moved onto San Juan Island, despite the Hudson's Bay Company already using the land for sheep farming. The British viewed the American presence as an illegal occupation, while the Americans saw the British as foreign intruders trying to limit their expansion. The two sides coexisted uneasily, but the situation remained peaceful, until a pig became the unlikely catalyst for an international crisis. The incident that triggered the Pig War occurred on June 15, 1859, when an American farmer named Lyman Cutlar discovered a black pig rooting through his potato field. This wasn't the first time the pig had wandered onto his property. It had done so multiple times, feasting on his crops. Frustrated, Cutlar grabbed his rifle and shot the pig dead. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irishman who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and managed the company's sheep ranch on the island. When Griffin learned what had happened, he was outraged. He confronted Cutlar and demanded compensation, reportedly asking for $100, a hefty sum for the time. Cutlar refused to pay, arguing that the pig had been trespassing on his land. According to some accounts, their conversation went as follows. Cutlar, it was eating my potatoes. I had a right to shoot it. Griffin, it is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig. This minor dispute might have ended there, but when Griffin reported the incident to British authorities, the situation escalated. British officials threatened to arrest Cutlar, which alarmed the American settlers on the island. Fearing British interference in their affairs, they appealed to the U.S. government for protection, setting off a chain of events that led to a full-scale military standoff. When news of the incident reached General William S. Harney, the commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Oregon, he overreacted spectacularly. Harney was a well-known anti-British hardliner, and he saw the situation as an opportunity to assert American dominance in the region. Without consulting Washington, he ordered U.S. troops to be deployed to San Juan Island. In July 1859, Captain George Pickett, an ambitious young officer, arrived on the island with 66 soldiers from the 9th Infantry Regiment. Pickett, who would later gain fame and infamy as a Confederate general during the American Civil War, wasted no time in making his position clear. He raised the American flag and boldly declared that San Juan Island was U.S. territory. He even taunted the British, stating, "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it," if they tried to remove him. The British were furious. Governor James Douglas of Vancouver Island saw Pickett's actions as a direct challenge to British sovereignty. In response, he dispatched 3 British warships to patrol the waters around the island, effectively surrounding the American troops. By August 1859, the crisis had reached its peak. The number of U.S. troops on San Juan Island had grown to nearly 500, while the British had deployed over 2,000 Royal Marines aboard 5 heavily armed warships. At any moment, a single gunshot, just like the one that killed the pig, could have sparked a full-scale war between the United States and Britain. As tensions rose, the world took notice. American and British newspapers reported on the crisis, and officials in Washington and London grew increasingly concerned. President James Buchanan, realizing the disastrous consequences of war with Britain, quickly sought a diplomatic resolution. He dispatched General Winfield Scott, one of the most respected military leaders of the era, to defuse the situation. Scott arrived in September 1859 and was astonished by what he saw. The island was occupied by heavily armed troops, with both sides refusing to back down. Recognizing the absurdity of the situation, Scott immediately met with Governor Douglas and British Naval Commander Admiral Robert Baines to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Fortunately, Admiral Baines was just as eager to avoid war. He famously told Douglas, "I will not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig." With this practical mindset, Scott and Baines reached an agreement. 1. Both nations would maintain a presence on San Juan Island, but with small military detachments to avoid further escalation. 2. The British and American forces would establish separate camps on different parts of the island. 3. No further hostilities would be allowed, and the dispute would eventually be settled through diplomacy. Thus, the joint military occupation of San Juan Island began. American and British soldiers lived on opposite ends of the island, but rather than remaining enemies, they gradually became friendly. The troops engaged in joint celebrations, held athletic competitions, and even drank together in local taverns. The so-called Pig War had turned into one of history's most peaceful occupations. For 12 years, this unusual arrangement continued. Finally, in 1871, the dispute was sent to international arbitration, with Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany serving as the neutral mediator. After a year of deliberation, the Kaiser ruled in favor of the United States, awarding them the San Juan Islands. The British accepted the decision peacefully, and in 1872, the Pig War officially ended, without a single human casualty. Today, San Juan Island remains a fascinating historical site. Visitors can explore American Camp and English Camp, where remnants of the joint occupations still stand. The Pig War serves as a reminder of how small events can have massive diplomatic consequences, but also how rational thinking and diplomacy can prevent unnecessary conflict. In the end, the only casualty of the Pig War of 1859 was a single pig. But that pig's story remains one of the most peculiar chapters in history, a war that never was, sparked by a dispute over a garden, a potato field, and an unlucky hog.